What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to be bringing you Spartacus Vengeance Season 3, Episode 3, entitled The Greater Good. And I know in the last episode review that I did, I talked about how I've been, sort of pleasantly surprised. And it's true here again. I mean, I'm really pleasantly surprised by how great the writing is, by how good the characterization is, by how good the concepts are. And I originally got into this show simply for the pure entertainment, but by the time it got to like I said before, the end of the first season, I realized that there was much more to Spartacus, and it's progressively been getting better and better and better. And I find myself, really being moved by these episodes and really, thinking about this in a sort of analytical way that I didn't expect that I would be when I first started watching. So let me just jump right into this review, like always. Broken down into two parts, the summary and then the analysis. So the summary is just going to be really quick. There's one overarching plot of this episode, and it basically deals with Crixus and the gangs. Yeah, like, Cool in the gang. But Crixus and the gang's various attempts to find and retrieve Navia. And the various ways that both Asher and Lucretia are trying to circumvent this. So that's basically the summary. I don't want to spoil anything for you guys, and that's basically the gist of the entire episode. But there are some very important scenes and moments that I want to analyze from this last episode of Spartacus Vengeance. So let me go ahead and do that now. The first deals with the relationship between Asher, Anameus, and Glaber. That's sort of established, I believe, right at the beginning of this episode, because in the last episode we see that, Asher has brought Anameus to Gaius Glaber. So Gaius Glaber, once he receives, Anameus, he doesn't believe that Asher is really loyal to him. And so what he has Asher do is he hands him, first he points out the brand of Batiatus on the inside of his forearm, but then he, hands him a knife. And of course the implication is that if you want to prove your loyalty to me, then you have to cut the brand off the inside of your forearm. And this is just really sick, but Asher doesn't. I mean, he cuts the skin, and they show it in the episode. He literally cuts the skin off of the inside of his forearm. I mean, that is just some really sick shit to do to a person. And again, this goes back to this motif and this theme that I've been sort of working with in throughout, the last couple episode reviews of Spartacus Vengeance, this idea, this theme about the corruption and the devaluation of life that is at the heart of Roman society and is at the heart of, Roman civilization. Whether it's about the mines or the gladiators or just the arena or, the slavery and the sort of, sexual exploitation that goes along with that slavery. But here it's a little bit different, and the relationship between the corruption and the devaluation that's at the heart of Roman society and Roman civilization, and between the slaves themselves and how the slaves are implicated in violence against themselves. It's really interesting because this episode sort of grapples with the sort of complex ways in which, there's violence that the Romans do to the slaves, but then there's a sort of violence that the slaves do to themselves. And this is symbolized in the way that Asher literally mutilates his own body to prove his loyalty to Gaius Glaber. So yeah, that's really sick, and it's really disgusting. But also what we what we get is there are two important things that we realize in this sort of interaction between Gaius Glaber and Asher. The first is that, of course, Spartacus is an incredibly violent and gory, show. People are getting hacked up, throats slit, everything, everything you can imagine that can be done to a human body, they show it on Spartacus. But there's a sort of new relationship that's established between the physical violence that's depicted in the show and the sort of psychological violence that goes on in the minds of the slaves. And not just the psychological violence, like I said, that the Romans inflict on the slaves, like the way that, Batiatus's father basically inflicted on Oenomaus. But there's also a sort of psychological violence that the slaves do to themselves. And this is something that's, sometimes missed because of the blood and the gore of, that's depicted in these episodes. And we get to see it in, of course, it comes up very obviously in between, Spartacus and Sora, in the way that, Spartacus was sort of, just basically torn apart by Sora's death. We also get to see it a little bit in this episode between Crixus and Naevia. But there are other, interesting instances of psychological violence. But like I said before, here it's very, very interesting because the psychological violence is about how slaves inflict that violence on each other. And so the psychological violence that's depicted in this episode is about how the slaves become complicit in their own slavery. And this is something, that I've been, studying as a college student and, through African American literature, obviously. But the one unique feature of slavery, and this is something that's very paradoxical, and it's very, very interesting if you, study slavery, in any society. But slavery always requires, it always requires the complicity of the slave to reproduce this sort of ideology and this structure of domination. It always works that way. And that's precisely what Asher is doing in this show. And that's precisely what's being symbolized by the fact that Gaius Glaber gets him to mutilate his own body. And there are four very important points where this occurs throughout, this episode and, even in the previous episode a little bit. The first is obvious that, Asher cuts, the skin off the inside of his forearm. But I would say the second part is, something that very interesting that happens between, Asher and Oenomaus. Asher is trying to, get Oenomaus to tell him precisely where Crixus and Spartacus and, the rest of the gang are. And Oenomaus just will not talk. He just won't talk. And so, Asher has to resort to, torturing him to try and, compel him to give up the information. And so when Asher starts, whipping Oenomaus, and, but something very interesting happens because as Asher is whipping Oenomaus, he gets to a point where he can't do it properly because, he cuts the skin off of his forearm, and so he has a wound. And so every time he hits Oenomaus, he has to, hurt himself in order to do it. And so this is another way of, this is another symbol of this sort of, psychological violence. But here it's depicted in a very physical way. The symbol is, made very literal in the fact that, every time, Asher whips Oenomaus, he has to hurt himself in order to do it. And this also is tied to another theme that you see depicted in the sort of, political movement and political formation that Spartacus, has created through the slave revolt and this, slave rebellion. And that theme is that, the destiny of the slaves are all tied together. And this is going to be very important for, the latter part of this episode review when I get to, something else that very important that happens in this episode. But the destiny of the slaves are all tied together. And as long as they submit to Roman rule, as long as they continue to be complicit in sort of reproducing this ideology in this structure of domination, within themselves, that they will, never be able to realize their own freedom, that they'll never be able to rise up against, this Roman Empire the way Spartacus and the way Crixus have done. And, in this scene, I developed some sympathy for Asher. And I know, a lot of Asher is, he's evil. He's part of, he's just, a tool that's being used by, his masters. And, we tend to see, Spartacus and Crixus as the good guy, and that, Asher is, the sort of evil one and the bad guy. But this whole, scene really, really made me sympathetic towards Asher. The fact that, he's forced to mutilate his own body to prove his loyalty to Gaius Glaber proves that, he's doing this so he can save his own skin. The only way that he can continue to, stay alive, and the only way that he can continue to live and, get favor, with the Roman elite is by, doing what they tell him to do, by basically becoming their puppet. And, this doesn't make him evil. It doesn't make him evil. It just makes him, a part of the system. It just makes him another, slave who's a victim to, Roman rule and the corruption of Roman society and Roman civilization. Another way that you can see this motif, this sort of theme of, psychological violence is even in the way that Asher speaks about himself. It's frequently the case, and as far as I remember, Asher's the only character who does this. But Asher speaks about himself in the third person, which is really, really weird, because nobody in, our daily lives speak about themselves in the third person. So he'll frequently say stuff like, Asher is the only one who can save you, Anameus. Or, you have to just talk to Asher or you will be at Asher's. He talks about himself as if he's not himself. And he talks about himself in the third person. And this is very important for sort of understanding the complexity of Asher's character. Because when a person, doesn't use, my or doesn't use I, when they don't use the first person, that generally it's especially in works of literature or narratives, that generally indicates that that person has no identity, that they don't have any self-identity, that they don't have a certain level of self-consciousness. And so the third person is a way of indicating a form of, what's known as objectification. Basically, when Asher talks about himself in the third person, he's referring to himself as an object, not as if he was, a real person who had, self-consciousness and who had self-identity. And so the fact that he's objectifying himself is, parallels the way that the Roman elites objectify him as a slave. And so you get to see how Asher, just in the very way that he thinks, and just in the very way that he refers to himself, is sort of, reproducing this ideology and reproducing the structure of domination, even in the very way that he speaks. He can't even speak about himself without, without referring to himself as an object, which is, precisely what the Romans depend on in order to keep the slaves, servile, and in order to make sure that they never get to a point where they can question, Roman authority. And the sort of fourth way that this theme of psychological violence is, worked out in this episode is through, Anameus. And even a little bit in the last episode where we get, Anameus's backstory. His purpose was absolutely warped. The meaning and significance of his life was absolutely warped by Batiatus's, father. And like I said before, this had a profound effect on him insofar as, he disfigured his own humanity. He no longer was able to, think for himself or live for himself or find out his own purpose, but rather his purpose was now, directly tied to someone else. His purpose was now, used to be an object for, honoring the house of Batiatus. And the fact that he would rather, opt for suicide rather than try and find out a new meaning or a new purpose for his life, or rather than join, the slave revolt and slave rebellion and the sort of political movement with Crixus and Spartacus, just shows you how badly Animaeus's humanity was disfigured by this experience of being a slave. And so these are, I think, going forward, in the series, this relationship between physical violence and psychological violence, and the way that the slaves, reproduce this psychological violence, and reproduce this ideology and structure of domination, is going to be very important moving forward. And you can already see in a way that it's going to be important for, what I want to talk about next. And that is the what happens between Agron and Crixus in this episode. So first of all, let me just say before I go forward, this part of the review contains spoilers. So if you haven't seen this episode yet, I would recommend that you stop watching right now, because I can't, analyze this particular section of the episode without, giving you some spoilers and some details about precisely what happened. So again, this part of the review will contain spoilers, and if you don't want to be spoiled, turn off the review now. So the next thing I want to talk about is this sort of what happens between Agron and Crixus. So at the beginning of the episode, Spartacus and the gang sort of, ambush somebody. They ambush some group of people, and I'm not really sure who they are. I don't really remember. But they were, obviously looking for Navia, and Agron and Nasir being the slave that they just recruited in, I believe, the last episode. They find a sort of a Roman soldier who knows what's happened to Navia, and he tells them that Navia is still alive and that she's working in the mines. And however, Agron decides to lie to Crixus, and the reason why he does this is because he believes that that Crixus is endangering the rest of the group by continuing to, search for Navia, and that he feels that, if he, lies to Crixus and tells him that Navia is dead, that Crixus will, give up this search, and, the gang could finally, coalesce around this one goal of, striking at the Roman Empire. But before I talk about the ethics of that, let me just say that, first, this is, very interesting in terms of characterization, because if it would have been the case that Navia did die, then that would have created a new dimension of the relationship between Crixus and Spartacus, because it would have showed how they were, first of all, we already know that Crixus and Spartacus are somewhat foils of each other, but that would have really solidified their relationship. And then they would have gone through the same process of grieving, and then the vengeance motif would have sort of applied to Crixus in a very similar way that it currently applies to Spartacus. And one interesting scene is where Crixus thinks that Navia is dead. And there's this, they speak in a lot of metaphors, and sometimes it's hard to follow them. But basically, Crixus was talking about how his hand is now empty of love and stuff like that. But then Spartacus tells him, but an empty hand can still become a fist. And so it would have been interesting to see them reach similar conclusions about, their political purposes with respect to, the slave insurrection and the slave rebellion that they, both helped to create. The second thing I want to get into now is this sort of ethical decision making that goes into Agron telling Crixus that Navia was dead, or that Navia is dead. So Agron, like I said before, he claims he made this decision for the greater good, and obviously that's allusion to the title of this episode, The Greater Good. So the greater good, he says, is that we have to, bind up this political movement, that we can't continue to risk our lives to save one person, and that what we should be doing is striking at the Roman Empire. Now, it's very interesting, because from an ethical standpoint, Agron is right. what Crixus is doing is incredibly dangerous. He's potentially sacrificing the lives of everyone there, not just the warriors, remember, because, you know, the warriors can somewhat defend themselves, but for all the people who can't fight, the women who are there. And I think there might even be some children there, but I'm not sure. But even if there aren't, he's still endangering the lives of everyone there, even the people who can't defend themselves, simply so he can find, you know, this one person, Navia. And so, you know, Crixus could potentially destroy what everybody has been working so hard to build. And at the end of this episode, he almost does. He almost does. So, to a certain extent, Agron is right. From an ethical standpoint, I think Agron is definitely right. Now, I would normally agree with Agron, you know, from an ethical standpoint, but from a political standpoint, I can't agree with Agron's decision. And here's why. Political movements, which is what I think, you know, this is, and I've said this on a number of occasions before. The political movements are about more than ethics. And that may sound like, you know, a paradox. Of course, you know, political movements, you know, at least if they're good, you know, they always include ethics. But political movements are not necessarily constrained by ethics. And here's what I mean by that. Agron's decision to sort of sacrifice Navia for the greater good of, you know, the political movement is reproduces a Roman way of thinking. It's the same way that the Romans think. The same way that the Romans devalue human life is the same way that Agron is devaluing, you know, Navia's life. And he treats Navia in the same way that the Romans treat the slaves. And again, this sort of ties into that theme of how, you know, the slaves themselves have to find a new way of thinking, because if they don't, they'll just reproduce this same Roman ideology and the same Roman structure of domination. Agron treats Navia as an object for his own political purposes. And it's, like I said, it's just like the way, you know, the Romans treat the slaves. They treat them as if they're dispensable. And in the same way, Agron would have hurt, I mean, if, you know, the truth wasn't revealed by Nasir, Agron would have hurt Crixus the same way that the Romans hurt Crixus, and the same way that the Romans hurt Spartacus. And so for this for these reasons, I have to agree with what Spartacus says. When Spartacus says, basically, if a single life doesn't have any worth, then no one else's life has any worth. Why? Because for the sake of the political movement, they could just decide that, you know, a number of other people are dispensable. And so they could just, you know, sacrifice them and kill them off if they wanted to. And so, you know, Spartacus his character is really developing in very interesting ways, because he's become a sort of, you know, warrior philosopher. He's, you know, he has this dual aspect to this character. He's a great warrior, but now he's sort of, you know, become a political thinker as well. And so part of what Spartacus is getting at here is that, you know, this political movement isn't just about violence against the Roman Empire. It's not just about vengeance. It's not just about revenge. And it's not just about killing a bunch of Romans. But it's about breaking down the Roman ideology, which sees slaves as just objects that can be used by the Roman elite. And so in order to break down that ideology, sometimes, you know, you'd have to do what would seem to be, you would have to go against what would seem to be the ethical thing to do, which is, you know, maybe you forget Navia in order to save the lives of everybody else in the group. And so, you know, Spartacus really goes against this, and he has, you know, a very specific political reason for going against the sort of moral argument that Agron was trying to make for, you know, sacrificing Navia. And so, you know, part of what, you know, the people who are a part of this political movement have to understand and have to realize is that human lives are not dispensable. They're not objects that you can just use for your own political purposes. And that's a very, very hard lesson to learn for everybody in this political movement, because it basically means that If you stick to the idea that everybody's life has value, then that means that everybody who's a part of this political movement has to be willing to sacrifice themselves for it, to die for it, to die for the sake of protecting and defending, other slaves. And so that's going to be a very, very hard lesson for them to learn, because like I alluded to in my last episode review, there are people who, are very reticent to embrace their status as, free individuals, and who, are just not ready to handle the responsibility of being free from, Roman rule. And so, the writing in Spartacus Vengeance continues to be excellent. Again, another 10 out of 10 episode for Spartacus. And the fact that they're able to navigate, various aspects of the political complexity of, Spartacus' role as both a warrior and a political thinker is just excellent writing on their part. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace, and have a blessed day.